Hi, everyone. Hoping that you all are doing well this Friday. We're going to be having a continuing discussion related to the question of the identity of Jesus. The entity known as Jesus, we're looking at the identity of the entity. There are a number of questions about the identity of Jesus, and these questions are in line with some of the questions that we have addressed with respect to Mary. Now, most people are aware that there is a worship dynamic going on with Mary, but there is also a specific reverence for Mary and a particular type of Mary in some of the European countries. And so we're going to be looking at this question of the identity of Jesus, and specifically, was the baby Jesus a boy or a girl? And hence, was the entity known as Jesus actually a man or a woman? Now, the reason this issue has come up is because of an attempt to obscure the name of the entity known as Jesus in the Hebrew. And so there is an identification of a name in the Greek that's supposed to correspond with a name that is in the Hebrew. What's interesting, however, is that there has been some finagling going on in order to create confusion about what the original name happened to be. And as you can probably guess, it's related to the God code. And so what has happened is there are all of these various spellings that have been offered with respect to the name Jesus in Hebrew. But what has also happened is one of these spellings, that is the accurate spelling, has been obscured. And there are a few explanations for why this has taken place in order to justify this. But what is happening is that if individuals accept the actual spelling in the Hebrew, that spelling changes the identity of the entity known as Jesus from a masculine identity to a feminine identity. Now, because this has been obscured, most people are unaware of the fact that this is even going on. But what makes this whole thing stand out is the God code. And so when you look at the actual transliteration, in terms of the meaning of the word Jesus, and going back into the Hebrew, what you have is a God code for the obscured name. And so the God code has been removed, and what has resulted is another name for the entity known as Jesus that incorporates another deity. Now, there is some confusion about whether or not these deities are even related, but that's what happens when there is this odd transliteration wherein Jesus goes from being a feminine entity in terms of the meaning of the name to a masculine entity. And again, there have been reasons offered for why this is the prudent thing to do. But what's happening with that God code dynamic is that not only is the God code being removed from the original understanding of the meaning of that name, but you also have the gender, if you will, the sex or the gender, being altered by this game playing with the words. And so with the original way that this name is supposed to be understood, you have a feminine noun. Now we're going to look at how this clever switcheroo has been taking place. And then there's, again, always the question of why isn't this being addressed? And why is it so important for the entity known as Jesus to be a particular race or a particular sex? Why is that so important? And why are there so many efforts made to alter the understanding of this entity known as Jesus? And then why is this secret worship going on with respect to Mary, who in these depictions is holding the scepter? And so if you don't know what a scepter is, I encourage you to do a little bit of research on the dynamic of a monarch and a scepter. And so you have Mary with the crown on, you have Mary with the royal garb on, and then you have Mary holding the scepter and the entity known as the baby Jesus holding the orb. And so I encourage you to look at what those two dynamics represent, the scepter and the orb, and why in this instance would Mary, an entity known as Mary, be holding a scepter. And here in our resource, The New Nation, we see these various transliterations and translations related to both the construct of creation or creator and also the construct of deliverer or salvation. And so you see these related names, Hosea, O'Shea, even Esau. You see YESHUAH with the I. You see YESHUAH. You see JESHUAH or Jesua. And so these names are related and they manifest in different ways in different languages. And so you might see the name in one language manifesting one way, and then you might see a transliteration in another way. Now, some of these identities are tied to entities that are considered human. However, some of these transliterations suggest that the entities have a divine sort of essence. And so you see that with the YESHUAH, ISHUAH. So now we're going to look at this game that has been played. Many people, currently hear people refer to the entity known as Jesus by other names like Yashael or YESHUAH. What's interesting, however, is you might hear a particular word or a particular pronunciation, but when you see the spelling that's attributed to it, it might not translate the same way, and it might have an altered meaning. Just by replacing one letter, you can have a totally different meaning, and that's what you have in the case of this name, YESHUAH. And we're going to look at these two spellings of YESHUAH. And interestingly, these names are not coming directly from the same root. And so with this one, you can see this spelling that's actually you see the English spelling, the YESHUAH ending in A, and then you see this other word in the Hebrew. Now, this other word in the Hebrew has letters that are not completely consistent with the letters down below, that YESHUA. With the Hebrew, there is another YESHUAH. And so you have a YESHUAH without the God code, and you have a YESHUAH with the God code. And so the YESHUAH with the God code at the top, that is a feminine entity. The YESHUAH at the bottom without the God code is not a feminine entity, but it also is not a deified entity. And so these are different identities that are being presented, but when you hear the sound, you are given the same sound. And here you get to see the actual spelling, the actual pronunciation in both English and Hebrew of this YESHUAH. Okay, so these are not the same, even though they slightly sound the same. That missing piece is very important, because that missing piece is changing not only the deity that's being identified, but also the sex or the gender of the entity that is being identified. And here you can see how difficult it is to actually research YESHUAH with the God code. And so what you have here is, if you try to search for it, it's going to try to redirect you back to the Yeshua without the God code. And if you are looking in Strong's Concordance, you may not even make it to the Yeshua with the God code, because you will be stopped right at the Yeshua without the God code, and with a different understanding of the meaning of the word. And so it's very interesting when you see that, and when you see how difficult it is to research it. And of course, the question is, why is it so difficult? Why is this such an important issue? And then you go back to when we were looking at the whole El Shaddai, El Shaddai, and all of the inferences that were pointing to that El Shaddai entity being a feminine entity. And then even when you look at the description of the entity that's supposed to be Jesus in the book of Revelation, of course, we have all sorts of questions about the book of Revelation, but we have this same dynamic going on again with this questionable identity, this suggestion that it's talking about a female or a feminine entity, however, referring to it as a masculine entity. And so we see this same dynamic in the Old Testament, and we see this dynamic in the New Testament. But what's really interesting is the playing around with the name in order to create confusion among people related to the identity that's being presented. And that's done very easily by tweaking the ending of the Yeshu. And so by simply taking that YESHUAH with the AH off, you have a totally different dynamic going on. Now, this is a very interesting, odd dynamic, because when the God code is taken off of the end of the Yeshua, what you have is this Hebrew letter, this Hebrew construct that is also related to the Greek letter Omicron. So when the God code is removed from Yeshua, you have a construct at the end that is again related to Omicron. It's that ayin. And interestingly, the ayin and the Omicron have this value of 70. But these entities are not the same, even though they might sound similar. They are not the same as the hey, that broken looking in over on the left hand side. They are not the same. And so again, as we've discussed before, that one on the left hand side not only turns something into a feminine noun, but it also adds this deity dynamic to the word. And you see this consistently over time. Now, Jesus isn't the only name wherein you see this weird confusion going on with respect to the God code sitting right there at the end, but an indication that the name is actually a masculine name. And so it looks like there are a number of instances wherein individuals in the Hebrew have feminine names, but we are told that these are masculine entities. It's unclear why that's going on. It's unclear, what the true identity happens to be of the people. And you can see by the story of Jacob and Esau that sometimes people are willing to do just about anything in order to get something that they want. And so some people are willing to deceive by putting on an outfit that makes them, sort of look and feel like an animal in order to get something that does not belong to them. And so there are a number of deception dynamics in the Old Testament related to this sort of thing. And so it shouldn't be very surprising to anyone that individuals might have over time decided to alter some of these identities and just hope that people wouldn't ask any questions or just assume or just not even care. Because sometimes people are so entrenched in a reality that has been given to them that when they see something that is in contrast, that cognitive dissonance does not allow them to even entertain the challenge to what they have previously understood. And that definitely would be going on with this Jesus narrative. And just even seeing Mary being deified calls into question a number of dynamics. But what's most interesting about all of this is that that many members of the clergy have identified this and have simply not addressed it. This is one of those inconvenient truths that many people probably don't want to deal with. It makes it very difficult to grow spiritually when people are not allowed to question what it is that they are taking in, and they are not allowed to critically think about what it is that they are taking in. And this is one of those situations where you see that. Now, of course, this all also goes back to all of that narcissism. And so many people will be disinclined to change the narrative of Jesus if it fits with bolstering their egos. And so if it bolsters their egos because there's a narrative about the race or ethnicity about Jesus, they will hold on to it. If it bolsters their egos because it identifies them with the sex or gender of Jesus, they will hold on to it. Okay, so there is plenty of motivation for keeping these narratives alive and not dealing with the questions about the narratives. We're going to look very specifically at the translation and transliteration dynamic related to the name Jesus so that you can see exactly what is going on here. And just for clarity, this is the name YESHUAH minus the God code. Oh, and I need to remind you that with Hebrew, you are reading from the right to the left. And so when I say that something's at the end of it, you might be used to the end being over on the right hand side, but in this instance the end is over on the left hand side, and so it's going from the right to the left, and so therefore the God code is over on the left hand side. And so that God code that you see over on the left hand side is added to the YESHUAH that you just saw. And so it looks the same with the exception of the God code. And so, again, it's just very interesting that individuals would be inclined to remove or not identify the God code in this particular name. And so here we are at Strong's Hebrew 3444. And what do we have? YESHUAH. YESHUAH. And it indicates specifically noun, feminine. The definition of this specific word is salvation. That's the meaning of YESHUAH, not Jehovah's salvation or Jehovah saves or Yahweh saves or the salvation of Yahweh. None of that. It is simply salvation. Now, because this name salvation, this noun salvation is feminine, many have offered that this is not the correct spelling of Jesus simply because it's understood as a feminine noun. Not that it's wrong, not that this is a totally different name. It's just this one right here is a feminine noun. And so therefore, since Jesus is identified as masculine or male, this could not possibly be the correct spelling according to these narratives wherein the spelling has been changed. And here you can see YESHUAH with the God code in the original word here at Strong's 3444. And here you see this construct in context. And so again, this YESHUAH is the word salvation. What's also noteworthy about these two spellings is that the YESHUAH without the God code, it's coming from two other etymology foundations. This particular Yeshua with the God code is coming from one foundation, and it is this Yasha. And so the other translations add in that Yahweh, Jehovah, to the translations. But the basic translation of Yeshua with the God code, it doesn't incorporate all of that. What's interesting also about the Yeshua without the God code is that when it is incorporating that Jehovah, that Yahweh, it's incorporating that word that is rooted in Judah or Yehuda. But with this Yeshua, with the Yasha, that's not included. And so it's just very direct what this is all about. And it doesn't include the essence of Yahweh or the essence of Jehovah in it. So the Jesus transliteration with the Yeshua and the God code, it's just very direct and to the point, and it doesn't really involve other entities. And so here you see that this word is translating as deliverance, help, prosperity, salvation, save, saving, security, victories, victory. And here you see very clearly that this is a noun, and it is feminine, and it is salvation. Again, also related to welfare and prosperity and deliverance. And here again, you see specifically that the name is referring to salvation, and then specifically by God. However, the by God part is not a part of the definition. The by God part is not necessary to the definition because inherent to the word is the God code. Now, what a number of individuals have done is they have determined that this Yeshua is not about a person. This Yeshua is simply about the construct salvation, because you can see that it would be in the lower case, and it's just referring to a noun and not a proper noun, and it would have to be a proper noun to be referring to a person. Well, if you understand how people are named in the Old Testament, they are simply named basically verbs and adjectives. And then once that verb or adjective is tied to a person, then it's capitalized and it becomes a proper noun suddenly. Okay, and so that's part of the dynamic that goes on. You see that with Judah and praise or celebrate it, because that's all you're talking about right there is praise, celebrate it. And so once they attach that name to a person, then suddenly it becomes a proper noun. Well, that's the same thing that happens when you attach this Yeshua to Jesus. If you're calling somebody by a particular name, then that name becomes a proper noun. And so here you see again, just in its essence, it's salvation. And here we have additional expounding on this construct. And so we again see deliverance, health, helping, salvation, save, saving health, welfare. And it's indicated here that in terms of etymology, this is a feminine passive participle of the word yasha, something saved, to aid, health, deliverance, and salvation. And we're going to quickly look at Yasha so you can see what this word salvation, this Yeshua, is rooted in. And so when you travel to Strong's 3467 in the Hebrew to this Yasha, what do you have? To deliver. So you have this verb, to deliver. So you've got a noun that comes out of a verb, and both essentially referring to the same thing. And so you have this verb, yasha, which means to deliver. When you look at Yeshua, what you have is salvation. And so you also have that God code at the end of it that changes the entire dynamic. And here are a couple of articles that address the removal of the God code at the end of the word Yeshua. And here you see in this particular one, this linguistic rationalization for doing this. But embedded in this rationale is this need to maintain Jesus as an entity that is considered sort of masculine divine energy versus feminine divine energy. What would be interesting would be individuals actually defining the distinctions between masculine and feminine divine energy and why it's so important to have one or the other for so many people. And here you see a little bit of this discussion talking about the ayin and the hey, and indicating in Hebrew that end H letter renders the word a noun rather than a proper noun, which is what we just discussed, and renders its gender feminine rather than the masculine name without the end hey. Okay. And so the person has a problem with this because this individual is offering that that's a poor choice. It's a poor choice to spell the Messiah's first name, Yeshua, ending with the H, because it makes the word less clear in meaning. No, in fact, it makes the word more clear in meaning. But for this individual, this is the rationale for doing all of this, for tweaking it. And then in this article, there's a discussion about the importance of the letter He and that God code, and why this letter is so important in terms of understanding the meaning of the construct of Yeshua, and also why it's generally missing. Now, this writer offers a slightly different perspective on the missing letter that makes up the God code at the end. However, coming to some of the same conclusions that this letter has been removed in this preservation of this Yeshua construct. The other question revolves around the dynamic of the X. Interestingly, the X is correlated with the construct of Christ. The X is also correlated with the construct of Savior. And you've even seen this interchange perhaps with the S and the X for Xavier or Savior. If you recall, when we were talking about the west coast of Africa, there was an identity known as Savi or XAVI, translating ultimately to this construct of Savior. And so you have the X associated with the Christ construct, the X associated with the Jesus construct, the X associated with the Savior construct. And interestingly, the X is associated with the female construct in terms of genetics. And we've talked quite a bit about the X before, and so you might want to return to some of those discussions. But there is this interesting correlation going on here with respect to the X. And of course, the X also represents the unknown.